science will fix society. What Lewis says is, there's a problem with that. He says, in making it, imagination runs ahead of scientific evidence. What does he mean? He means that we figured out what we wanted first. We liked this story about everything's getting better and science fixing everything. And so we found a scientific theory that says that, and we bought into it. We imagined what we wanted science to do, and then lo and behold, we found a scientific theory that said that's what's happening. And we said, great. He says the prophetic soul of the big world was already pregnant with the myth, which is what he calls evolution in this essay. If science has not met the imaginative need, science would not have been so popular. But probably every age gets, within certain limits, the science it desires. We wanted science to tell us how the world is moving to perfection. And evolution said, that's what happens. The world's getting better. Everything is moving to a perfect being. And he said, so we bought into it. What Lewis argues, though, is that that's not really even true when we think about it. He says, popular ideas of evolution lay a wholly unjustified emphasis on those changes which have rendered creatures, by human standards, better or more interesting. He says, we only talk about the stuff that we get better. We don't talk about all things that are worse than they were. We only talk about the good stuff. He says, in the popular mind, the world moving onwards and upwards, and if nothing else whatsoever, and it might have been predicted that it would do so. He says, but already before science had spoken, the mythical imagination knew the kind of evolution it wanted. The gods superseding the titans. If science offers any instances to satisfy that demand, they will be eagerly accepted. If it offers any instances that frustrate it, they will simply be ignored. What is he saying? That's a whole lot of text there. What's he saying? The world wanted to move away from the grip of religion. Religion was telling people how to live. Religion was telling people what was true. And the world of that era wanted to get rid of that. So lo and behold, science says there's a better way to think of the world. And Lewis said, so we bought into it. Because it told us what we wanted to hear. And Lewis is a convert, by the way. Lewis starts out as kind of an atheistic, evolutionary thinking person. And that's why this essay, A Funeral of a Great Myth, is him saying farewell to one of his favorite ideas. He says, I loved evolution. It was great. He says, but ultimately, you come to the conclusion it really doesn't work. And so I must bid it farewell. This is my eulogy for one of my favorite ideas. Like a bedtime story you found out wasn't true. He says, I have to say farewell. Because what happened is, he says, it's not really good science if you figure out the science you want and then you go get it. That's not how science is supposed to work. But that's really what's been happening with the story of evolution. He says, perhaps nature was once different. Perhaps the universe as a whole is quite different from those parts of it which fall under our observation. But if that is so, if there was once a dead universe which somehow made itself alive, if there ever was absolute original savagery which raised itself by its own shoulder strapped into civilization, then we ought to recognize that things of this sort happen no longer. The world we are being asked to believe in is radically unlike the world we experience. In other words, all the immediate plausibility of the myth has vanished. What's he talking about? What things did Lewis live through that he's describing here? Okay, at the end of the 1800s, the world's getting better. Science is going to make us perfect. Do you know who really believed that more than anybody else? Nazis. Nazis really believed that through science we could cull out all the bad. Let's start with the Jews. They've got to be bad, right? So we're going to cull them out. What's left? You know, we really think everyone and I have blonde hair and blue eyes. So we'll use science to change the gene pool. And we'll bring about a perfect solution. And the world looked at that and said, wait a second, that's not what science promised us. That wasn't the deal. Things were supposed to get better and better and better, and it really didn't happen. What we found out was science could produce really good ways of killing each other. Right? You had World War I. We did a great job of killing each other in that. World War II, we found great ways of killing each other for that. And we're still doing it. That science hasn't delivered on its promises of showing us the perfect world that we're supposed to be evolving into. And Lewis points to that to say, we got snookered, we got tricked, it didn't work out. That we were told the story and it didn't come to pass. And he says, evolution doesn't look like the world that I see. I see a world where some things are bad and they get worse. And sometimes humanity goes the wrong direction, not forward, but backwards. He says, we've seen this in history. great civilizations don't just rise, sometimes they crumble. And sometimes barbarism and the worst kind of savagery rules over even the enlightened world. He says, this stuff happens. And evolution says, no, only the best and the fittest things survive. And Lewis says, that's not the world that we know. And that should bother us a bit. Another argument that should make us second guess a bit, the theory of evolution, is the argument from design. Now, I'm going to move through this part of it very quickly. There is a lot of it in the notes. I try to be fairly detailed. There's math. I knew that on a Saturday afternoon at 3:30, me pulling out a whole bunch of math was a good way to put everyone to sleep. So I'm going to leave it out of this part of the lecture, but it's in the notes. If you want to look at just some calculations, some of it I've stolen, some of it I did from scratch on paper. In fact, there's one calculation. I calculated the statistical probability of getting 1 microgram of DNA from random chance. The number was so large, my calculator stopped doing the math, and I had to get out pen and paper and start rounding things off and figure out a way to do that that would give me an answer that was reasonable. The number was so big, if I told you about it, it would be silly. But DNA is a great example. I'm at this one point. One thing of math. The odds I calculated. I want you to think about the Great Lakes. Just one of them. We'll start with just one of them. The Great Lakes, if you were to go out there with a 1-gallon jug of whatever you want, 1-gallon milk jug, okay? It's empty. And your job is to empty the Great Lake. Pick your favorite one jug at a time, 1 gallon at a time. And you were to sit kind of on top of each other, all of these jugs. If every one of those jugs was a 0, you could write down the number of zeros required to give you the number of statistical probability. It's 1 in 10 to the, where'd it go? 10 to the 5 millionth power. There's not a name for that number because it's absurd. It's a ridiculous, absurd number. It shouldn't exist. It can't exist. You'd have to drain the Great Lakes to get enough gallons of zeros just to write the number. Not to have that many. You wouldn't have that many gallons. You would have enough zeros to write the number down. It's a patently absurd number. Statistically, what we're saying with the design argument is when you look in nature, you see things that don't look a lot like chance. You see things that look very orderly in design. The flagellar motor on E. coli bacteria, it has components that an engineer would be proud of. You look at that and say, well done. I mean, it's good engineering. All the pieces work together, and they only work if they're all there at the right time. That's all in the notes. DNA, again, is incredible. It's not just code. It's code that produces code. Sometimes DNA gets compared to a blueprint. That's a terrible analogy. If DNA is a blueprint, the blueprint for your house would make the house by itself. And then in the house there would be a room that made more blueprints to make more houses. That's how incredibly powerful DNA is in the living cell. And yet we're told that that is, again, a chaotic, or arises from chaotic processes and chance. And it's really silly. The human eye, as simple as the human eye, I'll spend a moment or two on that. The human eye is incredible, the things that it can accomplish. Charles Darwin himself was impressed and makes this suggestion. He says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I could find out no such case. So he acknowledged, if you ever find an organ in your body that's so sophisticated that you couldn't get there by slight variation and chance, then you need to throw out evolution. I don't know of any, but if you found one, that would do it. Can I suggest to you that something as simple as the human eye is that organ? It's incredible what it can accomplish. The human eye is a logarithmic detector, meaning that it takes the light that it absorbs and sorts it in powers of 10, so that you can see things as bright as the sun and as dark as a dark closet. And that your eye can process all that information in powers of 10, which is really incredible. The human eye can distinguish between different frequencies of light. That's how you see color. That's why you know the shirt is green, and that carpet is brown, and that cushion is red, because it's detecting the frequency of the light. Color is the result of the frequency of light. And so your eye, now would have to have a pretty sophisticated measure that. I have to have some good equipment to do that. Your eye does it instantaneously and just tells you about it, and you move on. I mean, you don't even think about it. You don't stare at someone's shirt, well, maybe you do. But most of us don't stare at someone's shirt and say, give me a minute, I'm going to figure out, all right, now frequency equals wavelength. No, you don't do all that. Your brain just spits it out and says red. And your eye processes that information and sends it in an electrical signal to your brain without you ever having to worry about it. The eye is controlled by a system of muscles that redirect its focus in fractions of a second. I mean, in fractions of a second. Before you know you thought it, your eye, without turning your head like I did, your eye shifts to the other side of the room. The muscles squeeze and reorient the optical parts of it to put things in focus. So now I'm looking at something close, like the text on my book. Now I'm looking at something far, I'm trying to read the clock, I don't care what it says, but I might want to look at it. These are things your eye does just quickly like that without really having to be taught. No one had to teach you that. But your eye is capable of all those things, essentially from birth. The eye, when used in coordination, can send information to the brain that is used to triangulate distance in real time. But I can take a basketball and poorly aim it at a basketball goal and throw it up there and get pretty close. Now, how did I get close? How did I know how far away that goal was? I have two eyes, they're looking at it from two different perspectives. Your brain does the calculation and triangulates the distance, and you coordinate that with your muscles, with your arm, you throw the basketball, and it gets pretty close. How are we able to do that? The eye is this incredible source of information, and your brain does a great job of processing it. To quote Robert Jastrow again at NASA, the eye appears to have been designed. No designer of telescopes could have done better. It is hard to accept the evolution of the eye as a product of chance. As a guy who worked with telescopes his whole life, he says, I look at the eye, and it's better than all my telescopes. It's really good at what it does, and no one had to make it. That you know. Right? No human being sat down in a laboratory and tinkered with it until they got the design right. It just works, and it's incredible. And that's the point of the design argument. Now, the evolutionist has a response to the design argument. It's kind of threatening and scary. So I want to take a moment and talk about this. The reason the design argument is not popular anymore with the scholarly world is because the evolutionists have come back with a vengeance and tried to kind of squash this argument. And here's what they'll say. The process of evolution predisposes the human mind to come to these conclusions. The only reason you think things are designed is because evolution made you think things are designed. Right? When you were a caveman somewhere, if you saw something that another human had built, you could go and live with that community and recognize human beings at work, and you survived. The people that couldn't recognize that died out because they were all by themselves. They didn't recognize other things that humans had done. And so that's the simple version. But evolution, though, saying predisposes you to recognize design even when it's not there. That's why you Christians think that when you look everywhere, you keep seeing design. And that's why people keep talking about gods and goddesses and creators and things, because you just keep seeing design, and that's the way you think the world works. Organisms that recognize design are more successful social creatures, and so the evolution of the human mind has produced a hypersensitivity to the appearance of design, resulting in humans thinking they see design everywhere. Okay? That's scary, right? But they had an answer for that one. I thought that was the end-all argument. I had my design, I had my stuff about the eye, and I'm done. But they say that's just something wrong with my brain. Evolution has predisposed me to be wrong about that. They're not arguing that you think it's designed. They're not even arguing that it looks designed. They'll tell you it looks designed to me too. But there's something wrong with my brain because evolution has made me sensitive to see design everywhere. And so that's just what it is. I see it all everywhere. What's the problem with this argument? It's a relatively modern argument. But C.S. Lewis was onto it a long time ago. Charles Darwin was onto it before that. Charles Darwin recognized there is a problem with this, and no one likes this quote from Darwin, but it's kind of scary. But Charles Darwin, I'm going to skip this section. Keep going. Okay? Well, okay. I'm going to get to Charles Darwin in a second. I want to go ahead and go through this. The problem is, can I actually know anything about the world if my brain has been programmed wrong? Right? Evolution tells me that through science, I can know about the world. I can know about how evolution works. But then when you tell them, well, my has said that this is the way it works, they say, well, your brain's wrong. Well, if I don't trust my brain, what am I supposed to trust? Evolution makes truth claims about the world as derived by science, but then it also claims that the human mind is wrong, that you're the product of evolutionary chance and you wouldn't know the truth if you saw it. See the problem with that? Telling you to use your brain to think about evolution, unless you come up with a conclusion different from evolution, and then stop using your brain's wired. See how that's a little bit tricky, right? Think about it a little more. For one thing, evolution bets against intelligence. I want to tell you a little bit about a creature called the Sphex wasp. It is an incredible story. Wait to the end. There's a punchline, so just wait for it. The Sphex wasp digs a little hole in the ground when it's ready to have children, and it will go kill a caterpillar of some kind that it's going to use for food. And it will drag the caterpillar up to its hole, and it will look down in the hole. It leaves the caterpillar behind because it doesn't want the dead weight. Right? So it goes down in its hole. It looks to see if anything has crawled in its hole since the last time it was there. Then it comes back up and it gets the caterpillar and it takes it back down in the hole. And then it puts its eggs on the caterpillar, the dead caterpillar, so that when the eggs hatch, they have food to eat. That's pretty clever. That's impressive. Some French scientists, because the French are bad people, they thought this would be, I'm just kidding. The French thought this would be a funny experiment. They said, what if we move the caterpillar? So the Sphex wasp goes down into its hole, and the scientist moves the caterpillar a couple inches away. The Sphex wasp comes back up, goes and finds the caterpillar, brings it back to the edge of the hole, drops it, and goes back down. Well, they're French, so what do you think they do? They move the caterpillar again. The Sphex wasp comes back up, looks around, goes and gets its caterpillar, takes it back to the edge of the hole, and then goes back down again to see if there's anything down there. You want to guess how many times they did this before the Sphex wasp figured it out? The Sphex wasp never figured it out. The scientist said, we got tired of moving the caterpillar. It never figured out that I've just been down this hole and there's nothing down there. Every single time it got the caterpillar to the same spot, it would drop it and go back down the hole. And never thought that someone might be moving the caterpillar. Now what's interesting about that? What I would suggest to you is interesting about that is that evolution created a really dumb insect. Right? It would have taken just a little more brain matter to give the wasp enough intelligence to say, I was just down this hole, I don't have to check it again. But that extra brain mass would make the wasp heavier. It would have to consume more food to fuel that much extra mass. It would be slower in chasing prey and avoiding predators. And so evolutionists tell us the Sphex wasp got rid of that much intelligence to be a faster, more nimble, more fit wasp. Because the fittest are not necessarily the smartest. Now I want you to think about that a minute. Evolution didn't produce a smarter wasp. That's what we've been told. Evolution makes everything smarter and better. No, evolution makes things better, not necessarily smarter. And the idea that we've been told even that the human race is the pinnacle of evolution, right? We're the height of intelligence. Not so. You know, if an alien came to Earth, they wouldn't look at the Earth and say, look at these wonderful humans. They'd say, this is a bug planet, and humans live there. There are 7 billion humans. There are 10 sextillion wasps and bugs and insects. The dumb things win, right? The fast, nimble, durable, unintelligent creatures win more often than not. So what I'm telling you is, if evolution has a tendency to make us dumber and faster, rather than slower and smarter, what does that say about me? And why do I think I would be smart enough to tell you anything about the world I live in? And again, it was Darwin who really came to this conclusion. He says, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or are at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? He says, in the end of the day, he says, I've got a really great theory. I think it's got a lot of scientific merit. It's very interesting. People like it. He says, but I've got a monkey brain. I'm just not sure if I trust it. And that's the problem with evolution. At the end of the day, they say believe in science, trust in science, listen to science. But that science, according to evolution, tells you that you are the least intelligent being that could possibly survive and continue your species. That any intelligence that might have made you slower when you were running away from a saber-toothed tiger somewhere in the distant past. The smart guy with the big head, he got eaten by the tiger. The dumb, fast guy survived. And so we're the dumbest possible things that could survive and be fit for the world we live in. But we think we can do calculus and figure out where we came from and use science. I mean, it's a vicious cycle. And Darwin said, as much as I like my theory, I always have this doubt. That in the end, I am telling you to believe me, even though I am telling you I have a monkey brain. And that's a scary thought. And I think that's a challenge to evolution. It's one of the things that happens in the human brain that evolution has this problem with. C.S. Lewis discusses it this way. He says, to reach the positions held by the real scientist, you must in fact treat reason as an absolute. But at the same time, the myth asks me to believe that reason is simply the unforeseen and unintended byproduct of a mindless process at one stage of its endless and aimless becoming. I'm here by aimless, chaotic processes, and that made me reasonable? That made me intelligent? He says, that doesn't really make any sense. He says, the content of the myth thus knocks from under me the only ground on which I could possibly believe the myth to be true. If my own mind is a product of the irrational, if what seems my clearest reasons are only the way in which a creature conditioned as I am is bound to feel, how shall I trust my mind when it tells me about evolution? They say, in effect, I will prove that what you call proof is only the result of mental habits, which result from heredity, which results from biochemistry, which results from physics. But this is the same as saying, I will prove that proofs are irrational. More succinctly, I will prove that there are no proofs. The fact that some people of scientific education cannot by any effort be taught to see the difficulty confirms one's suspicion that we here touch a radical disease in their whole system of thought. He says, this is a problem. Why aren't more people talking about this? Why is no one discussing the fact that we're telling ourselves we're as dumb as we could possibly be, but we, the dumbest people history has ever produced, are also the people who figured out how the universe works? There's something a little bit weird about that, and it should challenge what we think about evolution. I want to suggest to you that the church has a very different story to tell the world. Some people tell us we should believe in evolutionary theory because if we say anything else about Genesis chapter 1, no one's going to believe it anyway. They tell us that it's so challenging to modern thought that it's like a dead weight around the neck of Christianity. That if you believe in evolution, you can't even talk to anybody about Jesus because they think you're a crazy person who doesn't believe in evolution. I want to suggest to you that the story of Genesis 1 has always been contrary to cultural beliefs. That in every era, including the one when it was first told, it was challenging to the people that heard it. And if we adopted the mentality then, hey, people think this Genesis 1 is crazy, let's not talk about it, because they won't believe our God if we tell them this crazy story about Genesis 1. We never would have had Genesis 1. The people in that day and time said, this is an important story, it needs to be preserved and passed down, and it is in our Bibles for that reason. In the ancient world, people believed all of the gods descended from some other god, right? I have it in your notes. From the Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian or Akkadian creation myth that's possibly as old as Genesis, depending on where you date stuff. But it's the kind of thing that looks like what ancient people thought about the creation. And what did they say about their gods? Well, all things that exist come from father and mother, Apsu and Mamo Tiamat, and then develop separate identities. Marduk is the god of the Babylonians, for example. He's the son of Enki, son of Anu, son of Anshar, and of Lamu, son of Apsu. Okay? All the gods have this elaborate family tree. Right? Read Genesis 1. Do you see that at all? Genesis 1 says, not so. The God we're proclaiming to you is different than what you believe in. And boldly declares that. In the beginning, God. Well, wait, where did God come from? No, that's it. Well, where is his sons and daughters? He doesn't have any. Where is his parents? None. There is one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. That's the basic tenet of Old Testament thought in Numbers chapter 6. This is when you're supposed to believe in. And Genesis puts that out there boldly. First sentence out of the gate. In the beginning, God. Just God, nobody else, no family tree, just that God. And that must have drove ancient people crazy when they read that sentence. All the gods are at war, right? The ancient Babylonian documents about their God have their gods fighting all the time. Guess what the Greek gods did? They fought all the time. You know what the Roman gods did? They fought all the time. Now read Genesis. Do you see gods fighting with other gods? Israel says no. Our God is one God. He has no rivals. No one is comparable to him. He alone sits in heaven, and he reigns there in peace, not in war. Because on the seventh day, he rested. Okay? It's a beautiful picture that they put right in the face of a world that says not so. The ancient world believed that the gods were afraid of sea monsters. I don't know if it is or not. I didn't. I had to learn it. You read these ancient documents. The Babylonians believed that sea monsters were the creation of one of the gods as weapons against the other gods. So the gods of the land fought the gods of the sea, and the great sea monsters were the weapons of the gods they were afraid of. That sounds crazy enough, but the ancient world says, yeah, that makes sense. The ancient world says that's a perfectly reasonable idea. What about Genesis? Genesis 1 says, nope. God created the seas. God created the things in the seas. He made them all, and they were good. That's the word Genesis uses over and over again. And he saw what he made, and it was good. Not a weapon of evil, not something to frighten him later. In fact, there is a passage I want to share with you. In the Psalms, it suggests that the Leviathan, which would be the Hebrew concept of the scariest thing that ever was in the ocean, the Leviathan was kind of like a rubber ducky. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. But in the Psalms, it's in Psalm 104, 25 and 26. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things, both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. Quite literally, the word play there is from the Hebrew word, you might translate it frolic. He made this thing that people are terrified of. It's the rubber ducky in the ocean. It's the little plaything that God threw out there. The gods of the Babylonians are terrified of the darkness of the seas. Psalmist says God made all that too, and he's not afraid of it. So my point is that every step along the way, what about the human race? Babylonian writings says the human race were savages created by the gods to be servants and thralls to their divine whim. Genesis 1 says God created man in his own image, and he was very good. It's a whole different picture. So what my point is, why did I go through all that ancient stuff? If the story of Genesis was important enough to hold on to, even when it challenged the thinkers of the ancient world, I should not be surprised or discouraged when it challenges the thinkers of today. Today, the great thinkers of our time tell us the universe is a pretty dark and ultimately a pretty depressing place. Carl Sagan, before his passing, very famously wrote, almost every species that has ever existed is extinct. Extinction is the rule, survival is the exception. He said, so those who wished for some sensual cosmic purpose for us, or at least our world, or at least our solar system, or at least our galaxy, have been disappointed, progressively disappointed. The universe is not responsive to our ambitious expectations. What's he saying? The universe does not care that you're here. It has killed a lot of things before you, and it will keep on killing things after you are gone. It is a dark and sad and empty place. Genesis says, not so. Genesis states the opposite claim. In every step in the pattern of creation, God pauses to look and say, this is good. It has purpose. It has meaning. And when he creates man, again in his own image, he gives him purpose. Here is work for you to do. Here is a life for you to live, and it means something. The universe is not a dark and empty place, because Genesis 1 says, contrary to modern opinion, God remains in it. Furthermore, We're told that modern opinion in evolution that humanity is the byproduct of a lengthy and ultimately chaotic process. The Bible says instead that your God, the only God who has ever been or ever will be, through a deliberate and personal and intentional process, created you by his own command, as succinctly as he could speak. And that through that very intentional process, all things have come into existence at his word. It's an incredible difference to the world that's being taught today, but that's the different message that the church offers. Furthermore, Christianity offers a different ending to the story. And as we draw towards the invitation this afternoon, let me give you this to think about, of why this is important for evangelistic purposes. The story of evolution is the greatest of all tragedies. C.S. Lewis, I've mentioned several times because I think his essay on this is just great. He says, I'll tell you what I love the most about evolution. If you love a sad story, evolution is a great sad story. He says, all this time, nature, the old enemy who only seemed defeated, has been gnawing away silently, unceasingly, out of the reach of human power. The sun will cool. All suns will cool. The whole universe will run down. Life, every form of life, will be banished without hope of return from every cubic inch of infinite space. All ends in nothingness. Universal darkness covers all. True to the shape of Elizabethan tragedy, the hero has swiftly fallen from the glory to which he slowly climbed. It is indeed much better than an Elizabethan tragedy, for it has more complete finality. It brings us to the end, not of the story, but of all possible stories. He says, I used to be an evolutionist. He says, I used to love it because it was a great tragedy. The world comes up to its best possible moment, and then the universe swallows us anyway. It all ends in darkness and terribleness. He says, that's a great sad story. C.S. Lewis says, I read a few of those. That's a great tragedy. If you want to see a tragedy, that's it. He says, the fact is, though, it's just not true. And the Bible is the only source, and the church that preaches it, the only place where you will hear the alternative to that story. In 2 Peter 3:13 to 14, but according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth, in which righteousness dwells. Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these, be diligent to be found by him without spot or blemish and at peace. But there is a different hope for Christianity. That those that have died will be resurrected, that there is a place that awaits, provided and prepared by our God, and that this is not, or at least doesn't have to be, the worst of all tragedies. The Christian message is a positive, optimistic, hope-filled, and imaginatively hopeful doctrine. And it stands in complete contrast to the shadow that evolution has cast over our dying world. I beg you to believe in that great story, both of what God has done and what he will do. As the prophet said, Isaiah chapter 46, 8 and 10, remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purposes. Let that be true, and let us say amen. If you've not believed in that saving gospel of Christ, based upon the basic belief, not just in God, but that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him, that he has a purpose for what he has made, and that purpose is fulfilled in submission to Christ Jesus. If you need to respond to the gospel invitation, why don't you do